All right, let's get started here. Hey, thanks everyone so much for coming. My name is Zack Johnson. I am visiting you from the great city of Boston, Massachusetts. So I flew into Philly, and my wife's from Lancaster County. So when I was driving here, we're about 2 hours from Lancaster. Is that about right? So I'm closer than I thought from where I belong. So I want to open our session with a quick song. Are people familiar with "We Rest on Thee"? I'm not the best singer in the world, but does anyone know this song? Oh, so you're going to have to help me. It's an important song as it relates to who I am and where I come from, but maybe I'll sing it and you can kind of join in with me if you're comfortable with that. We rest on Thee, our shield and our defender. We go not forth alone against the foe. Strong in Thy strength, safe in Thy keeping tender. We rest on Thee, and in Thy name we go. So about 50 years ago, this hymn was sung before 5 missionaries were martyred in the jungles of Ecuador. Some of you might be familiar with the stories of Nate Saint and Jim Elliot and Roger Youderian. Are people familiar with those martyrdoms? And so that caused a wave of missionary activity in South America, and particularly some of the wives of the men that were killed stayed behind with their children and tried to finish the work of their husbands. I think it's one of the most amazing stories in recent times. And then there's a man named Steve Saint, who was Nate Saint's son, so his dad was speared to death, then converted a man called Mincaye, and then Steve Saint and a man, Mincaye, who killed his father, now travel the world doing gospel presentations on the power of what it means to love your enemy. Isn't that a beautiful story of what it could mean to love your enemy? And unfortunately, over the course of time, the Christian teaching of what enemy love means has really been changed. And it's been about a 2,000, you guys know, when did Jesus deliver the Sermon on the Mount? Around 2,000 years ago, and those 2,000 years have been very interesting to watch what has happened with those sets of teachings. And so that story is very important to me, the story of the missionaries, because my family then was recruited by a doctor named Wally Swanson to travel to Quito in Ecuador, and then they were to go and build a missionary hospital. And then I lived in Rachel Saint's house, which was Steve Saint's sister, and that's where I grew up my whole life. And so the story of martyrdom framed my entire existence and where my family comes from. When I think about the set of teachings in the Bible, there's a set of teachings called the Beatitudes. Who of here are familiar with the Beatitudes? All of us, I just heard them on the stage, and I'll just read them really quick here. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So there are a couple ways of thinking about the Beatitudes. One is that when Jesus gave these Beatitudes, he was just thinking about his people and saying, hey, it's very nice if you do these things. Like, it's nice that if people are meek. It's nice if people are peacemakers. But there's also another way of viewing them, and a man named Charles Spurgeon called the Beatitudes he called them the ladder of light. That you actually walk up a ladder and you develop these character qualities in your life, and then there are 8 Beatitudes, and then the 7th Beatitude would be what? It would be, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And then what happens after, in this theory, what happens after you become a peacemaker? What's the eighth conclusive beatitude? Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And so I guess my question for you is, what is peacemaking, and how does it relate to enemy love? Was Jesus just saying, hey, it's nice if you're a peacemaker, or is he calling us to climb this ladder and to become a peacemaker, and then with a great expectation of martyrdom, persecution, and sacrifice? If there's one passage that I would read every day in my life, or one piece of literature, it would definitely be the Sermon on the Mount. When you think about that set of teachings, the different people are actually making them more familiar. There's a man named who's here familiar with Jordan Peterson and sort of the American public scene. He's starting to call the Sermon on the Mount the Christian operating manual. And I wanted to just read the two passages that I'll be referencing today. This is in Matthew 5. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anybody wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun shine on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So I'm gonna just frame my story a little bit for you before I launch into my thoughts on what it means to love your enemies. And I just gave my testimony to a young group here this morning. Was anybody at that? So I'm gonna repeat my joke just because I want to make people laugh. But I was born and raised in Quito, and then fast forward my life forward. I spent 7 years in the Air Force, and then decided to apply as a conscientious objector I was an officer in the Air Force, and then was released in 2017. And a man named Tim Miller heard about my story, and he sent me a note, and he said, hey, can you come share your testimony with my church? It was in Holmes County, Ohio. Hey, John, I know you. And I showed up to a stranger's house, and I was a little bit nervous. It was a new setting for me, and I asked the man, I said, hey, can you just give me a little one-liner to make the crowd like me? And he said, oh, if you try to say something in Pennsylvania Dutch, they're going to love you. So I was like, got it. Teach me what to say. So he says, I'm going to teach you how to say, it's good to be here. So he said, say, sis good for dulci. So I was like, sis good for dulci. Got it. I get up in front of the crowd. I said, sis good for dulci. And yeah, there's a laugh right here. And then I actually used that greeting for the next 4 years of my life when I share my testimony. And then finally, a very kind person came up and said, do you know that you're saying it's good to be dead? Not it's good to be here. So do and dot are the nuances there. But I've made my made my lessons here. So like I said, born and raised in Quito. At 18, I decided that I was going to join a place called the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. The United States has 4 main places that they commission officers out of, and then one for each branch. One is West Point, which is the Army, Annapolis, which is Navy, Air Force, which is Air Force. They don't have a cool name for it. And then there's the Coast Guard Academy, and they produce around 20% of the officer corps, which is way higher than any other college. The ROTC spreads the other 80% throughout different colleges. And then after the Air Force, at the Air Force Academy, I quickly learned that the Mormon Church was taking over the world with their missions, and I wouldn't have that happen on my watch. So I decided to take a gap year, and I worked with an organization called Samaritan's Purse. Some people might be familiar with Samaritan's Purse. Spent a year in Mozambique doing disaster relief and international development. And I told a story in the morning that's where I first encountered somebody who challenged me on being in the military and following Christ at the same time. He was from a Quaker background, and he basically kind of said, hey, Zack, I don't think these two are compatible ideas. And I said, you don't know who I am. I grew up in Rachel Saint's house. And then we just kind of had a loving relationship. And my time in Mozambique culminated with a moment where a mayor had stolen some money from a public coffer to cover relief in emergency situations, and a lot of hospital patients were in danger, and I ignited my passion back up to go and be like, evil's got to be wiped out, and kind of was motivated by that. I spent 2 years back in the Air Force Academy, and then they sent me to a place called the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. So that's a place in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that kind of where a lot of the political thought leading happens. And I mentioned earlier that I could have never painted my life like that, but I got my congressional nomination to go to the Air Force Academy came from Joe Biden at the time. He was vice president, so I wrote in a letter, and Joe Biden gave me my nomination. And then right after the Kennedy School, I worked at LA Air Force Base doing work for the U.S. Space, and I hosted my job was a congressional analyst, and I hosted a senator visit. Any guesses? A senator from California who I hosted at the Air Force Base there. So Kamala Harris was my first congressional visit, and now I look at American politics and I'm like, strangely, my life is intertwined with with American politics. And at the Kennedy School, there was a debate where I got to hear Donald Trump and Hillary kind of come to the Kennedy School in open forum, and I was training to go and drop bombs on targets. At that point, ISIS was the main target that the U.S. was pursuing. That was the big enemy, and something in the back of my mind started to haunt me at night, and I was like, I don't agree with this person. I don't agree with this person. In a year's time, I'll be killing in their name. They're the commander-in-chief. At the academies, there was a little bit more religiosity built into the military, but then, as I discovered, as you sort of zoom up to the levels of government, I rarely heard people tying the decision-making to the pursuit of God, which was very important to me. And so I applied as a conscientious objector and went through a pretty intense process to leave the Air Force, and they basically said, hey, best case scenario, since you went to the academy and we put you through school, we'll approve your application and you'll owe around $500,000. And I was like, oh, I'm a missionary kid. I don't have that money stored up. And then I said, well, what's worst case scenario? And he said, well, worst case is the trial or the lawyer will deem that you're insincere. You'll owe the money and you'll go to prison. So I was like, oh, phenomenal. And so the decision to leave the service while having made a commitment to the military is one that is it's not a light decision for anybody to make. I went through with the decision. I became completely and utterly convinced that to follow Christ, that you have to take the Sermon on the Mount at face value. And there's lots of ways to go around it, but I through studying and reading, that's what I decided. Went through the process. My mom died along the way, and then I was miraculously let out by the Secretary of the Air Force. Has to approve all officers. And then the man who tried to give me that debt approached me and said, I've tried everything I can. You can leave. I have no idea how to give you that $500,000 of debt. So I walked away scot-free, and then drove over to Boston, where I've been working at Sattler College ever since. And what was that? Question?
Somebody said question.
Oh, I had a question, sorry. So I just want to give you a quick roadmap for how I'm going to walk you through sort of the different places that I've been and how we think about applying peacemaking and loving our enemies, and try to give you a little bit of framework on how I think about it now. I'll introduce you to something I call the 4 quadrants of peace, and a term that I call sacrificialism, which is tied to what I think is the essence of enemy love and peacemaking. And I'll make 6 points, and I'll make a brief conclusion here. So when you think about how to divide the different worldviews that look at the world, I found it really helpful to just answer kind of 2 questions about somebody. The first question is, hey, what's your relationship with God and the Creator? Do you view God as an important force to deal with and to have a relationship with, or is God not important? And then the second sort of question that I thought is useful is, that I love actually asking this people is, hey, how do you think you should treat your enemies? If you ever ask somebody that, you'll get a bizarre set of answers on how people treat your answers. And then when you combine these 2 together, you get these 4 quadrants, and I think I'll walk you through how you can how I think about how different systems work, how different systems of academia work. And when I think about it, I've come up with a little mantra in each corner to think about, hey, this is kind of how I would characterize the pursuit of these relationships. So people who have a very high view of God and a high view of enemies, I like to say that their mantra is no blood but our own, that we will sacrifice, we will go to the utmost ends of the earth, but we will never shed somebody else's blood, but we are incredibly willing to give our own blood at the drop of a hat. We'll do it. These are the kinds of people that we should be. When you move into this other quadrant here, I call it as little blood as possible, that's a set of people who kind of have let go on what God is. God kind of can be ambiguous, and it doesn't really matter who he is, but there's still a general good thing, that it's a good thing to treat your enemies right. So I've spent a lot of time in secular environments, and when I tell people about, hey, I don't use violence, they're like, that's so cool. That's amazing. But then when you start to bring in the teachings of Christ is when you start to differentiate that, I'll take the nonviolence, but don't give me Christ there. And so I think you can kind of relate to the sets of people that are sort of operating in this camp. Another word for it is globalism. And then in this fourth quadrant are people who God is not necessarily important, and enemies are definitely not to be treated well. It's mostly about security. And I like to view these people as saying as much blood as necessary. So the world becomes about your own physical security, and you make your decisions framed around promoting that security, and that's like your key thing to fight for. And then over the course of time in Christianity, as I mentioned before, there's a group of people who have a really high view of God, but then the view of enemies has changed over time, where enemies are actually to be viewed lower. And this is where the just war theory has come out of. And there's a huge swath of the American church that I would put in this category, and they kind of scream as much blood as is just, that, hey, if there's justice to be served, that it's our duty to enact that. And when you lay that out, I like to just say that the people who scream no blood but our own, there's no better picture of that than Christ on the cross. When you think about what Christ was teaching, and if there ever was a moment where violence was necessary, I think in the course of human history, that Jesus on the cross could have commanded legions of angels to come to his aid, and it would have been the most just moment in all of history, but he didn't. And in the realist camp, I'll switch here, down in the fourth quadrant, there's been a sign of resistance that has come up and made its way across politics and political movements and revolutions. Has anybody ever seen a fist spray painted on a wall anywhere in the course of their life? And so it might be a familiar symbol, but this is sort of the revolt symbol that has come up. And if the government does something you don't want, it's time to revolt. A lot of us saw instances of this in a few summers ago after the George Floyd incidents here in this country. Maybe you didn't pay attention, but this fist started getting spray painted, especially in some of the cities that I lived. But now, in terms of sort of politics, the people who have a high view of enemy have actually really started spearheading something called nonviolent resistance. And so now there's something where you actually can resist the government, but do it peacefully. And then in the as much blood as just category, this is a picture of what the Crusaders would have used and thought of as a good way to go about it. Do these four quadrants kind of make sense with how people are going about interacting with their enemies? So in my own story, when I think about enemy love and peacemaking, I always like to try to map the different places that I've been onto this. And so at the school I went to, I actually just met a graduate of my high school. John, did you know that? There's a guy here from Quito, Ecuador, that graduated the same high school I had. Anyway, sorry. Marcus. His name was Marcus. So somebody went to this school, and I met him here. That's never happened in all of my time. So something cool is happening. But when I graduated high school, and I was decided to go into the Air Force, I got a standing ovation from my community, and it was like I was the hero going forth to fight for God and country. And then there was one family Cesar Moya. I think John Showalter might know him. Their family, I knew his daughter and I went to school together. They were always weird about me going in the military. I didn't figure it out until later, but I think they're part of this conference in some way. I had no idea. And when you look at Samaritan's Purse, so they're a really interesting organization too. That they'll hire Quakers, but they'll hire Quakers and they'll hire. They really want to do evangelism, but over the course of time, it's very hard to run an organization that does international relief and development when you're competing for government money and you can't use that money to do evangelism. So I sensed in that organization, and my father was a country director in multiple countries, that there's a strong pull for even evangelical groups who develop to do poverty alleviation away from God and towards sort of a physical safety component. The Air Force is such, and the Department of Defense in general, they're just like, enemies go. Our job is to put the enemies away. So, but ironically, at the Air Force Academy, God is so intimately connected to what it means to be in the military. I think that's changing a little bit in this country, but I'll give a little bit of a story. At the Air Force Academy, they have this chapel, and it's the highest structure that towers over the campus. You can see it from the highway in Colorado Springs. Has anyone ever driven by the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs? You know what I'm talking about. And this chapel looks like this jet, this like spider jet that's flying into space. And it's just, when you walk in, there's a cross on the background, and it's in the shape of a sword. And so when you walk in and you're like, man, and when you go to this place, you're like, I am serving God by wielding this sword. And there was a petition made to try to build a building that was just higher than the chapel, and it got shut down due to the general saying the highest building will always be the chapel here at the academy. And so there's still a lot of thinking about how God interacts with the use of force here. And then I'll just say that in some of in the realms of higher education where I went to school at Harvard, that God it's completely not about God anymore, and there's people in both camps on, hey, God, let's not worry about God, but there's people that smile upon the idea of peace and enemy love and things like that. And many of these people are motivated by really good things. I'd like to mention that since I left the Air Force, I'm allowed to say things here openly. I decided to go get a certificate in peace building from the Center for Justice and Peace building down at EMU. People might be familiar with that program. And I Googled, because I'm so obsessed with this idea of like, what is peacemaking? Like, I want to get good at this. I want to be a son of God. And in my program there, they produced a few Nobel Prize peace winners, which is the highest accolade you can get in doing peace work. When in all my classes there, I only took 18 credits. How many times do you think I heard the word Christ mentioned in the classroom so this man right here? Yeah, 0 times. I never heard Christ mentioned in the classroom, which for me was really hard because that's the whole reason that I left that system. And so I would place like, there's a little bit even in the Anabaptist world of a shift away from God at the center and the shift away from Christ. I also met phenomenal people there, so I know if anybody has connections there, I'm not trying to tear it down, just making an observation here. So my question is, for the future of the trajectory of people who want to be a Sermon on the Mount literal people, what will it take for us to train an army of people who will scream no blood but our own, and who will go and sacrifice and not use violence and create new institutions and keep doing missions, love our enemies, and not lose God? I feel like that's sort of the charge that is set before us as a people. And when I was going through my trial to leave the military, this is a man named Finney Caravella. He works with me at the college, and the lawyer asked him, he said, hey, can you explain your theology very simply to me on why it is that this young man needs to leave the military? And he said, it's very simple. We serve a king. His name is Christ. He gave us a constitution. It is the Sermon on the Mount. And we have a people, and we need to build it. It is the church. And I remember just listening to this interaction it kind of felt like a centurion, and for me it was like, this is like the centurion and Jesus. And I remember the lawyer just kind of nodding his head and saying, that makes sense. That Christ is king, Sermon on the Mount is constitution, church as people. is sort of a political alternative to the just war theory. And I shared earlier this morning that the lawyers actually just wrote me actually like 2 weeks ago and said that he left the Air Force and has been convinced of nonviolence after reading through my application. I'm like, praise God, like, this is tremendous. And I'm actively trying to, I shared that I'm actively, if you know of anybody who is considering leaving the military, it's one of my greatest passions to meet people. I've walked around a dozen or people out, and they've applied to leave. But the hard part is they've gotten that debt. I've walked 3 guys out of the Air Force Academy, and they figured it out. And these guys are walking around out with making this $400 decision at the early end of their life to make that decision. I think that's like tremendous faith. And all for this idea of no blood but our own. And just to sort of frame this, that I really do think that there are many people that have pure motivations in all realms of how to go about making peace. And I don't map on ill intent onto the other people. So there's a man named Dave Eubank. Is anyone familiar with the organization called Free Burma Rangers? So there's a guy here. And so this man, he's a former Army Ranger. He started a little organization, and he runs around doing medical work in Burma and Iraq, and just literally running with no weapons to save little children. They still carry guns and run behind tanks, so they're not completely non-resistant. But you think about this man, it's like, this man has a belief that he's willing to die for, and as little blood as possible. Does anyone recognize this lady? So her name is Zaida Catalan, and she was shot as a UN peacekeeper next to a man named Michael Sharp. Anybody know Michael Sharp? So Michael Sharp came out of the Goshen community, and then he joined the UN and then did peacekeeping work in Sudan, and he was beheaded not too long ago. Both of them, they believed in what they were doing enough to go and become martyrs. Let's think about this: as much blood as necessary. There's a man, his name is Pat Tillman. Pat Tillman in 2002 had it made. He was an NFL linebacker. The 9/11 attacks happen. He turns in his football jersey, throws on a green beret, that's a special forces of the Army, and is killed 3 months later in combat. So I guess my just non-rhetorical question is, what do these people have in common? Yeah, they're willing to give everything for their belief in how to make the world better. And so us as a Sermon on the Mount people, my question is just, will we keep the stories alive? And will we be replacing many of the martyrs before us who had this belief, or will we sort of let it slip? I love surveying audiences and saying, hey, do you know of anybody who's actively doing this? And I've gotten good stories, but it's not an obvious world where there's a lot of people participating in different institutions. So when I think about peacemaking and enemy love, in essence, peacemaking is a radical reshifting of the way that we think about ourselves as we relate to other relationships, where rather than care about, most importantly, ourselves, we care about our neighbors and others before ourselves. We care about even our enemies before ourselves, and then on the outer edge is ourselves, and our job is to reconcile everyone to God, every human soul on the planet to God. And so a dotted line on this graph sort of represents this idea that I'm able to be reconciled to God, and then this is my own take on it, but strikingly, when I think about this, I wrote the word state on this corner. When you think about Christian peacemaking and enemy love, I would posit that the state and the kingdoms of the world are not to be reconciled to God. The individuals within them can, but it's not the state that happens through. It's actually the church as the holding tank that really facilitates reconciliation to God. And I guess my question to you is, what do you care about most? Do you care about your own things? Do you care about your own safety? Or will you be somebody who elevates the importance of others beyond yourself? And even most shockingly, the people that disagree with you most, who could be called your enemies. Do you truly look at somebody who you could consider your enemy and say, I'll do anything I can to reconcile their relationship to God. There are two peacemaking artists in the Bible that I love to point out, and I'll just read you sort of this at play in the Bible, and it won't be shocking, but this is from Exodus 32, verses 31 and 32. Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Oh, these people have committed a great sin and have made for themselves a god of gold. Yet now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, I pray, blot me out from your book which I've written." So it's interesting, you see Moses interacting with God after the golden calf, and he's saying, "God, if you won't save them, then count me out." In Romans, Paul says a similar thing. He says, "For I wish that I myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my countrymen according to the flesh, who are Israelites, to whom pertain the adoption, the glory of the covenants." So Paul himself is trying to indicate here that other people are more important than me in this grand scheme, and hence a radical shifting of who is most important comes with how do we think about enemies and how do we go about peacemaking. So I mentioned I went to EMU there, and I wanted to make just a couple of points about peacemaking and enemy love. The first point, and it's seemingly obvious, is you cannot make peace without sacrifice. When I think about the story of the Ecuadorian missionaries, Roger Udarian, Pete Fleming, Jim Elliot, Nate Saint, Ed McCauley, when you enter into conflict, there is going to be sacrifice. It's not a if, it's a when. And peacemakers should be a set of people that don't demand their own rights, that are willing to relinquish everything for the sake of others. One of my favorite quotes from Jim Elliot, he wrote down right here, "He is no fool who gives that which he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." It's one of my favorite sayings outside of the Bible, that you're going to sacrifice, but you're going to gain everything in the end. And then, number two, just regarding our enemies, no blood but our own. When you think about an enemy, and maybe I'll survey the audience a little bit here. Who do you think of when I say enemy? What's the first person or group that comes to your mind? Or do you not have? I mean, maybe it's good if you don't have enemies. Oh yeah, right here.
The first enemy we would think of is Satan and his army.
Satan. He's the primary enemy. That's a good one.
No, the battle is it's not hurting flesh.
That's right.
But then there is no enemy. I mean, that's two-sided.
I put Satan in his own camp, but any human enemies that you guys can think of? Bullies, yeah, bullies. And my general thesis is that most of you in the room probably don't have somebody that you think is going to come and slit your throat tonight, do you? Any of you? And so the idea of non-resistance, I think a lot of us can get lost in just saying we don't use violence, but then it becomes it doesn't even matter in the way that you live out your life. Jesus' teachings about loving your enemy have to apply to us in some way, shape, or form. So after giving his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, one of the first people that Jesus interacts with is the Roman centurion, who is sort of an ideological enemy of Jesus. So I would just ask you, are there sets of people, maybe ideologically, that you don't get along with, that you can apply the teaching of enemy love to? It might be within the church, it might be a political group, it might be somebody else without of it, but whenever you think about your enemy, you're not trying to go for their blood or their bullying. And when you put this all together, I just want to remind you that what we should be thinking is dragging people into this top right corner of no blood but our own, where if somebody cares about equality, we're saying, yeah, but can we care about humility and someone cares about security, let's drag them into loving their enemies as well, and then also freedom. I give a huge academic talk on this topic as well, and so if you go to nobloodbutourOwn.org, you can download this and sort of see the key differences between those groups there. All right, and my third point is that Christ's peace flows from tradition 1. and I'm going to explain myself here a little bit. When I was in the military in Boston and I was searching for truth, I went to 16 or 17 different churches, and I was trying to figure out which church has sort of the keys to enemy love. And over the course of time, there's basically there's an author that posits there are basically three types of churches: Tradition 1 churches, Tradition 2 churches, and Tradition 3 churches. So Tradition 1 churches in this framework are people who say, hey, the ultimate authority is the Bible, but it's not the only authority. That when you're studying the Bible, that a huge part of trying to answer the hardest questions is studying church history. And so when you're trying to answer the question about, hey, what does it mean to love our enemies? Can we use violence? A great place to turn for the Tradition 1 people is to the early church and to people who were closest to the set of teachings of Jesus. And so there are people, the Tradition 1 churches hold the Bible as the ultimate authority, but not the only authority. And then Tradition 2 churches, I would say, are people who have propped up man's traditions and made them almost equal with the Bible in terms of how we interact with them. A great example of this is sort of the teaching that priests have to be celibate in the Catholic Church. You won't find that in the Bible, yet the church holds a lot of people to it. And then one of the greatest dangers is, in my mind, is Tradition 0 churches. There's a famous line by Martin Luther in the Reformation. He said, sola scriptura, which means only Scripture. Tradition 0 churches, they yell, solo scriptura, or I'm alone with Scripture. And these types of churches are the ones who kind of say, I can get the Bible and I can figure this out by myself, and it doesn't really matter what church history says. And so when you look at the set of churches who subscribe to that and you try to answer this question, what does the Sermon on the Mount mean? How many denominations have crept up in Christianity worldwide? I just Googled this before giving the talk. Does anybody have a rough guesstimate of how many denominations there are?
126.
You're really low. So over 30,000 denominations. And so you got to sit back and realize, man, like, I'm raising kids. How am I going to point them to the right church? And this is where I think that the idea of Tradition 1 churches and answering questions through the lens of the Bible on top of church history is massively important. And just not to let go of, I'm going to label this traditions, as something that was celebrated, taught by Jesus, and then enacted by the early church over time. It's these kinds of teachings we can't let go of. And then the other thing I just want to mention is small acts of faith are the building blocks of peace. So this is a picture of my mother. I can't even look at it without getting a little scared. But my mom was somebody who, every day I came home from school, and she would be on the couch reading her Bible. Like every single day. And I look at her, and she never had a grand martyrdom or a grand testimony to tell at the end of her life, but every day she was faithful in these small things. And those are the things that build into everyday peacemaking. If you think about non-resistance and peacemaking as something that you might encounter only once in your lifetime, I think you're going to get it wrong. There are peacemaking opportunities that abound every single day. And so my question to you and to all of us is, how are you going to apply the teachings of enemy love into your everyday relationships on top of being able to stand for this idea of Christian nonviolence? I said this earlier this morning that one of the things that somebody told me once, that treating peacemaking like nonviolence is the same as treating marriage as non-adultery. That there's so much more to peacemaking than just not using violence. It's an active force that we should be actively applying in our everyday life. And there's a set of Christians right now, I don't know if you've bumped into them. There's a man named Ken Sandy, and they're trying to spearhead a movement called peacemaking or peacemaker ministries. And anytime that you encounter conflict in one of your relationships or even in your life, you have generally three paths to go along. You can escape, you can peacemake, or you can attack. So in this framework, anytime you're entering conflict, you have three options. How many of you in here just love conflict and are like, I want to debate? So there are some people that love debating, and you can come into assault, litigation, and ultimately murder. How many of you just don't like conflict and you're like, tuck me in bed and cover me up with the covers? Yeah, a lot. Yeah, there's people in here, and so your tendency is going to be towards escape, denial, fight, and ultimately suicide are sort of the grand scopes. And so it's the peacemaker's role in everyday conflict to learn how to overlook things, how to pursue reconciliation, how to get good at negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and then sometimes even accountability or church discipline. So what I'm trying to say is just because you're not in the military and you don't have somebody trying to slit your throat doesn't mean this doesn't matter to you. All of you are going to participate in peacemaking and should be on a regular basis. My fifth point, peacemaking is an art and peacemakers are poets. So this is a picture of the Orange Line in Boston. And does anyone in here take public transportation on a regular basis anywhere? Oh, I'm alone in this one. All right, so right after I left the military, I was working at Sattler, and I had this big bag of fleeces that I was going to hand out to students. And there were these two men on this train that broke out in a fist fight, and I was sitting right in front of me. And I was thinking to myself, I was like, this is it. This is the moment. I'm ready to put this peacemaking into action. And it was really weird because I was, I had this training where I could submit them and put them both in arm bars and make them tap or something like that. But I was I had this big bag of fleeces, and I got up and I stood in the middle of them, and I was just trying to block their punches with each other, doing this little dance on the subway. And they were looking at me like, this guy's a fool. And they ended up sitting down and just laughing, and they got off. And I was just thinking to myself, I think there's a certain creativity in peacemaking that's not obvious all the time, and that's just a silly story that I like to share. But I also have read a set of books written by a man named Pablo Yoder. Is anyone familiar with Pablo Yoder down in Nicaragua? So when you look at the set of the corpus of teaching out of there, I heard that there were men in his church that used to fight against each other in the Civil War in Nicaragua, and then now are under the same banner and the same fellowship. I was like, I want to go visit there. And this man and his story, they moved to Nicaragua, and there are stories of him as a missionary where people would break into their house and threaten to rape his twin daughters, and he would serve them up a cup of tea, and he would pack them a backpack with a Bible in it and send them on their way. And then they would take that backpack, and then later on they become converted into the church because of how strangely he treated them. This is what sort of it means to be creative and poetic in your peacemaking, that in any of these sort of gotcha moments where you would expect violence, some other people call it the third way, that there's always a third way that rejects contradicting Christ's teachings. And my last point, and hopefully it sort of goes with some of the themes I've been hearing here, is that peacemaking is bound to soul winning. And so when you think about the quadrant system here, that it's so easy. I've been a part of this so many times in my life where I get involved in a really important project, and it's immediately there's a drift away from evangelism, almost always. I've seen it in my school. I've seen it in Samaritan's Purse. I've seen it in my church, that you start something and you're like, I'm going to evangelize, and then all of a sudden it becomes about something different. And it's the same. I think it's the same with peacemaking, in that ultimately peacemaking involves reconciling souls to God. And there are definitely amazing works that we can get a part of, like demining and disaster relief and war zone conflict work. That's very important, but the odds is that soul winning won't be at the forefront, because soul winning is hard and it's not very sexy. I use that word a little bit loosely, but if I were to go down and recruit a bunch of young men to be like, I'm going to get you into the best shape of your life, I'm going to form a special forces unit, and we're going to go do medical missions on the front line of the war, I could probably recruit, I could probably recruit 20 men pretty easily. If I say, I want you to spend the rest of your life learning how to win a soul, it's a little bit harder to do that and to train people in it. And so I'll finish, or I'll end there with this, or close to end with this quote from Charles Spurgeon, who is the same man who talks about the Beatitudes as a ladder of light. If there existed only one man or woman who did not love the Savior, and if that person lived among the wilds of Siberia, and if it were necessary that all the millions of believers on the face of the earth should journey there, and every one of them plead with him to come to Jesus before he could be converted, it would be well worth all the zeal, labor, and expense if we had to preach to thousands year after year and never rescued but one soul. That one soul would be full reward for all our labor, for a soul is of countless price. And I think that's like the ultimate reminder in the sets of relationships that whenever we go about designing principles to our ministries, do we believe that conclusion of Spurgeon, that a soul is the one thing that is of countless price? So I opened up with this question of what is peacemaking, and it's hard to define in a simple word as Jesus taught it. But I will share that at Sattler, one of the classes of mine put together this definition, and I think it's a pretty good summary. Biblical peacemaking is Jesus following, and it looks much different than most modern endeavors at peacekeeping or peace building, which kind of take God out of it. While disarming combatants and societal transformation is certainly on Jesus' agenda, he did not seek to hijack or to develop the political institution of his day, nor did he use force or coercion. Rather, he preached the good news of the kingdom of God. He instituted the church, calling them to obey his teachings in the Sermon on the Mount to bring his peaceable kingdom to earth through loving service. Principled nonviolence is at the core of peacemaking. This can be defined as a way of life modeled after Jesus, one that completely rejects violence, actively confronts evil, and unconditionally loves others by practicing gracious hospitality, radical forgiveness, and deep compassion. Love in action. To imitate Jesus, peacemakers confront the evil of conflict with self-sacrificial love. And then they just said, we, the peacemaking class of 2021-22, believe that sacrificial love will transform any conflict zone, large-scale or personal, into a peaceful situation. We proclaim, no blood but our own. And if I was in a large room, I'd yell that, but it's a little bit of a small room here. And just to rehearse my points, you cannot make peace without sacrifice. Regarding our enemies, no blood but our own. Christ's peace flows from tradition one. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you're laying Christ's yokes aside, then reconsider what you're doing. Small acts of faith are the building blocks of peace. Peacemaking is an art, and peacemakers are poets. Peacemaking is bound to soul winning. And my hopeful conclusion for all of you is that King Jesus is on the move, and he's going to claim his church with or without you. I like to mention that all of us, that there will be ultimate victory in the day. I don't know how it's going to happen, but he's coming, and I want to be a part of it every day. I wake up and I look at the Sermon on the Mount, and I think, how can I put this into action? And I've just been really struck by the response to some of these ideas in here. There's a man named Mohammed Bakari. He's studying peacemaking in the Netherlands, and he heard this talk online somewhere, and he emailed me this picture, and he's a Muslim from Pakistan, and he said, hey, I heard your talk, and I'd follow Jesus if this is what Christians look like. So he drew this, and he said, can you show this at the next time you give a talk? And I look at that, and I'm like, it's pretty beautiful. Like, this should be tied to what Christians are. The light of the world, the salt of the earth. And then, if you're interested, you can go to the website, No Blood But Our Own, and you can download logos, buy some merchandise. I'll be probably continuing the brand and things over time. So if you want a cool shirt that says No Blood But Our Own, I don't make any money off it, so you can go there. And I think we have a little bit of time. I'd love to end with any questions for me from the audience. I know we have about 10 minutes for that in case anybody has any. And if not, feel free to go out, and I'll end there. So thanks so much for listening to what I had to say. Any questions?
What do you think about nonviolent resistance?
In terms of the political activists. So my initial take on it is from a secular standpoint. I love when people don't use violence. From the Christian perspective, one of the things that I think Jesus calls us to is what? Submission to the governing authorities, right? And so the idea that Christians should participate in nonviolent activism is a little bit confusing to me if you try to match it to some of Jesus' teachings on when he said, give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God's what is God's. And so as a Christian, I tend to not involve myself in sort of challenging the government. And one way that I actually think about this is when I was studying that I'm fairly familiar with some of the generals in U.S. history. There's a man named George Marshall who taught that the ultimate soldier, and he was the ultimate soldier shouldn't vote. And you kind of look at that and you're like, well, why is that? And his case was that any soldier should be able to serve any position of power regardless of sort of their policies or their positions. And so he ended up serving 3 presidents, switching back between parties, and they all kept him in the same spot. And that's kind of what I think about Christians as we relate to the policies over us, is that unless there's a direct challenge to the teachings of Christ, I think that our place is to be a people who is respectful and honoring of the king. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so I shy away from it, but in terms of me picking if people are going to use civil war or nonviolence, I would always choose the nonviolence, right? If I could build that bridge.
Do you think that peacemaking and setting healthy boundaries are compatible with each other, or would a peacemaking have just less boundaries
What kind of boundaries are you talking about?
Just like maybe not feeling safe with someone in a relationship, or setting boundaries.
This isn't like dating, is it? Okay.
General.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like getting into conflict or.
Yeah, just kind of like setting those boundaries, I guess, for yourself of like what you feel safe to do or not.
Oh.
I guess.
Like are you going to go into a dangerous place and be a peacemaker? Yeah, I think I face this a lot more as a husband now with a dad with kids, where before I was married, I'm like, let's go to the hardest place on the planet. And then your first kid is born and you're like, look at this child that God has given me. And so I think that there's a healthy role that a peacemaker is called, not to make dumb decisions. But at the same time, I think peacemakers are ones that sacrifice land, family, and jobs all the time for the sake of the kingdom. And so I think there's a danger in the comfortable life that America's really good at offering people. And so I'm not calling people to make dumb decisions. And so I meet a lot of young guys, and they're like, what if we like snuck into the battle zone and just like ran out and tried to like disarm a tank? And I'm like, sounds like a little idealistic. Does that kind of make sense though? But I think you can set healthy boundaries and still sacrifice. But I think the bigger ditch is comfort and not ever making a sacrifice.
As church leaders, if we're not dealing with conflicts among leadership or at church level, do we have a platform at all to speak into young people wanting to join the military or not?
I think that you as a church leader always have a platform of the church. I think Jesus gave the church the keys of the kingdom. In my story, I was just telling this earlier, that when I was it was a church called Followers of the Way in Boston, and it was the church that that sort of I found them, they found me, and I was handed this book, and I quickly became aware that they taught peacemaking and non-resistance, and I was in the military, and my first instinct was, not again, like a bunch of crazy hippies. I just wish I could find somebody. But then I took it seriously, and what I'll give you my personal stance on this, but you can feel free to take it or leave it, is that I think the communing group of a church should decide what Christ's teachings are, and they should hold people to those. And if people decide that they're not going to go with them, then it's their decision to be outside the communing group at that church. It's really church membership. But that if you have somebody outside attending like a public gathering that doesn't necessarily have the affinities with you. I think that there's a point of ministry there of ongoing, and we want to have this dialogue, but I think that the group of communing members should be a group of committed people to the teachings of Christ. And I'll just say that if the church would have told me, we'll treat you exactly the same as we would treat somebody else, I don't think there's a chance I would have left the military. And so I think that's up to different people to navigate, is how strongly do you believe in this teaching enough to call somebody out and give some teeth to your teeth to membership, right? What does it mean to be a Christian? And that's where I fall way harder on this, that I'm like, I wouldn't have made this decision if I didn't believe this is what it takes to follow Jesus. But at the same time, I know a ton of guys in the military who I think are really well-hearted, and I wouldn't say that I'm not going to reserve final judgment that, I'm not going to make the salvation proclamation here on earth. I don't think that's mine to make. But I think I can say, while on this earth, this is what it means to follow Christ. And to draw some hard lines there, and to have your membership have some teeth. That's my take on that. So, yeah.
What are you to do in a situation where you are responsible for people who are not your own, and like school shooting, for example? What do you do there? Like, it's like you have no chance of escape.
Like, should you use violence or should you not use violence?
No. What would you do in that situation? You can't give up the children of someone else.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can go into a billion hypothetical situations.
I'm just saying, in a situation you're responsible for someone else,
right?
And there's someone of violence.
Yeah, the one that people love to talk about. Hey, Zack, you love your wife. What if somebody breaks into your house and wants to hurt your kids and hurt your wife? What are you going to do there? And I'm responsible. I think the ultimate answer is I do everything in my possible power to protect and defend while not doing something against what Christ taught. So I still think that the sword has been taken, that Jesus took away the sword and the use of violence from the Christian, and that's just the way that I operate now. And so anything around that, I can still protect and defend. And at the end of the day, I still think this is where we could go a million miles down this. There's a guy named John Howard Yoder who wrote a lot about this in the Mennonite world, but you're more likely to get those people into trouble if you use violence and you're not trained to, just from our perspective, that if there is an actual violent threat and you're going to meet that with violence, you're more likely to do more harm to somebody in that group that you're protecting. And so there's a weird moment where I think Jesus' teachings actually work. Shocking, right? That if you follow Jesus' teachings to the T, I don't think you'll ever regret it, even though it could be hard. I know that's
You said from our perspective, were you saying that like from like where you were trained in the military's perspective?
Yeah,
you would say that?
That's where I can't. That's where if I'm the law enforcement authorities, I can't preach the Sermon on the Mount to law enforcement while they're actively engaged at law enforcement. And so that's where the Christian interaction with this gets tricky. That we just don't use violence, and if people are going to follow Christ, we call them out of it. Does that?
No. What my question was more in response to her question. You said that they're more likely to cause a problem.
Oh.
And you said even to our perspective. I didn't know if you meant like is that the trained perspective that says people that are trying to respond with violence to those are more likely to hurt.
Yeah, I'm talking about your average homeowner.
Yeah.
Your average homeowner who, I don't want to paint a caricature, but your average guy who's like,
I'm gonna shoot him.
You're right. If somebody breaks into my house, I'm going to kill them,
Yeah.
and aren't trained with weaponry. They're more likely to create more havoc than not to create havoc. Is kind of what I was getting. But I would still say, do what you can to protect those under your care without using violence. I know that's a little bit of a hard answer, but that's kind of where I'm on it. Sir?
Talk about church community, and basically we're kind of talking about excommunication without using the word, but I think I know at least one or two youth pastors, maybe even in our are not, who would tell their young people, we have a lot of young people here today,
Right.
that it's okay to go into the military as long as you somehow keep your Christian conviction. It's a good way to get an education. It's a good way to, kind of get your foot in the door economically with a good job and such. So you really expect us as pastors to tell our youth who are wanting to go into the military that if you do that, you're not going to be a part of this community?
Yeah, I think this is probably the hardest question to get, but for me, when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, there's a injunction to make peace, and then Jesus says not to use violence, and then he says not to take oaths. And for me, in my story, I sought a position that actually wouldn't use violence, and they gave it to me. But then I said, and I can't take oaths, because actually Jesus' teachings on oaths and follows what I read there. And the military didn't have a place for me of somebody who wouldn't use violence and wouldn't take oaths. So by nature, I take a very literal approach to those teachings. I know that people probably haven't studied that out, but that was very important to me, that when you look at the oath that someone takes in the military, it's along the lines of the words of, I will protect and defend the United States Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that I take this obligation freely without any purpose of mental reservation. And then you can say, so help me God. And that's sort of being taken out because it's the religious language. And so, but if you look at Jesus' teachings on let your yes be yes and your no be no, I would challenge every Christian and to say that they have every mental reservation to obey the top authority to protect the Constitution, and that there's a challenge of allegiance between saying yes to that and saying yes to Christ. And that's where I think that there is a stark contrast. And then this is where I think in this group I'm a little more clear on it, and I still really sympathize with people who want to do that, but I still think that those sets of teachings in the Sermon on the Mount make it really hard to exist within the system that as a follower of Christ. Does that make sense? And so the moment of the oath is a really interesting one too. And I would just encourage people to read some of the early Christians on what was happening with Rome. And there were Christians that were getting their heads cut off to refuse joining the Roman army. And I know that it's a little bit different in our context, but it's not. I still think it's not incredible. It's not that different. And so I would just still be really, really challenging people to look at what you're doing when you take that oath, and really make sure that you look at the Sermon on the Mount and say, are these two compatible? And I determined that they weren't after a lot of study, and my church has too. And so I know that that's a hard decision to make, but it's one of these things like, what if Jesus meant every word he said? I think he really did. That's where I've landed on it. So I know that's where I land on it. So thanks for the question. Sorry if it's not a...
No, it's okay. I mean, it's just, I think some young people, even within the Mennonite church, we don't necessarily like your decision, but you go ahead and we'll bless you, we'll have prayer for you when you leave, and we'll dedicate your life to Christ in the military.
Yeah, and this is where maybe I'll just add in a little bit of a thought on the word excommunication and church discipline. When you look at the church, and hear me out that I'm 5 years into thinking about this, so I'm not trying to give all your past I'm not trying to give all the answers here, but when you do tell somebody that they shouldn't be part of the church, Jesus kind of teaches to say you should treat them like tax collectors and sinners. And then, but how did Jesus treat tax collectors and sinners? That he was actually super loving to the people that he said would be put out of the church. And so I think that if the church decides that, it's not a shunning, it's actually we're going to love your socks off and not sort of ask you to leave the community. You can be within us, but it's that group of membership of people committed to this, and I think each group has to decide what that is for themselves. And I think the early Anabaptists, at least, were some of the first movers are creating what was called a closed group in communion. And the Catholic Church did it too on people who had to adhere to the literal set of teachings. So, yeah. All right, well, I know this session was over 10 minutes ago, so please feel free to, and I have a tiny little sticker there. If you want to grab it, it says no blood but our own. If you want to put that on a water bottle or something, feel free to do it. Thanks so much for coming and joining the hot room in here. Yeah, 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 the hot room in here. Yeah.